So here's Jesus would be the ultimate example of a just man who was treated as though he was a wicked man. Now, if there is no God, or if you don't have God in your thinking processes, that is a big problem. I mean, if this life is all there is, and yet wicked men are prospering and good men are suffering, I think I'll be a wicked man. If this is all there is, why not be wicked? And that's exactly what he says there in verse 16. Or verse 15 rather. Then, after considering that, he says, then I commended mirth, because a man has no better thing under the sun than to eat and drink and be merry. So, he said, when I thought about it from this perspective, my conclusion is, man, eat, drink, and be merry, because you better get it while you can. That's all there is. There's no more. And you might as well grab that while you have a chance to do so. That was his conclusion from that perspective. Now, again, I would argue that if that perspective is the correct one, there is no God, our time here on earth is all there is. What should you do with your time here on earth? Man, do whatever you want, but especially do whatever you want that brings happiness to you. And if my happiness is stealing your car, I'm going to steal your car. If my happiness is to go out and party and drink and carouse and cheat on my wife, and if this life is all there is, why not? You might as well. Because he says there at the end of verse 15, for that shall abide with him of his labor the days of his life here under the sun. So in other words, that's all that is, and that's all that will last, and it's only going to last while you're here under the sun. You might as well. So now, again, pointing to our chart and trying to understand the direction or perspective of Solomon, don't you see how this is really a key to our understanding? Because if you're not grasping the broader context of what Solomon's saying, then you could go out and start preaching. The Bible says, eat, drink, and be merry. Do whatever you want. Is that what the Bible says? Well, that's what Solomon said here, but it has to be understood in context. You see the importance of that, making that distinction? Any thoughts or comments here? Eric?
It's curious, you said earlier that, do all these things because there is no God. It's his attitude. But it's interesting to me that in verse 15 he mentions, what the days of his life which God gives him under the sun. But I'm not sure. Does your version say?
Yeah. It mentions God there in verse 15, and it mentions him again in verse 17, I think. Yeah. He mentions God, but I think he just mentions him in the sort of the broad generic sense. The days that God or whatever, I think that's probably the way I'd say. The days that God or whoever or whatever gives you to live. I don't think he's talking about God in the sense of the true God of heaven who rules all things. I think he's just saying the days that, if I were going to paraphrase, the days which are given to you to live here on earth. I think in this context. I agree, it's a little confusing that he would mention God in these verses when he's talking in this sense. But I think it's more in the sense of the days that are given to you while you're here on the earth. Any other thoughts or comments? Monty?
There's a lot of people that believe in God, but they don't really believe in him, that he's someone we're going to have to give an account to, that we're going to have to answer to, that he was given us rules to live by. They just believe, well, there's a higher being out there somewhere. He's there, but that's pretty much the extent of it. So if you look at it in the context of what he's talking about here, when he says the days God has given you, it's this days that this supreme being has, you ain't got to run strike you dead yet or something. But it's not that we have an answer to it and have it for account.
Yeah, I think it is in that generic sense. He's saying whatever forces there may be that control the affairs of life, they give you this time to be upon earth. Notice again, in verse 16, I applied mine heart to know wisdom, to see the business that is done under the sun. And I'm not sure about that phrase, for also there is that neither day nor night seeth sleep with his eyes. I think that's the idea that the cycle just keeps continuing here on earth. Day and night continue. They never sleep. They never stop. I beheld all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. Because though a man labor to seek it out, yet he shall not find it. Yea, further, though a wise man think to know it, yet shall he not be able to find it. Is it true that you cannot find out? You can seek wisdom, but you can't get it. You can't find out the meaning of life. Basically, that's the concept there, right? He said, you can work as hard as you want. A very wise man can work as hard as he wants, and he will not be able to discover the meaning of life. Is that true? No. That's not true, is it? That's not true. We know the meaning of life, don't we? And even here in the book of Ecclesiastes, you remember Solomon's famous conclusion. Chapter 12, verse 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Solomon found it out, but he didn't find it out when he was just pursuing it as a worldly man, to grasp meaning as a worldly man. So, if you didn't have the Bible, let's throw this away. What's the meaning of life? I don't know. I can't figure it out. I can't figure out what the meaning of life is, because I'm not receiving the information God gives me, right? And that's the tone that Solomon is using there. It's not true to us who believe that God has revealed the meaning of life in his inspired word. But ignore this, and it is a true thing. You can't figure it out. I saw a couple hands. Mine, did you have?
Well, that's basically what I was going to say from the context he's talking about in this section about the wisdom of man and what man is capable of himself of doing. No, we can't figure out the meaning of life. But when we include God in his revelation to us, God has revealed the meaning of life to us.
Yeah, exactly right. Jeff?
It's a sad thing to say, but it's true, Greg, that the majority of the world subscribes to that line of thinking you were talking about earlier. They think this life is all there is, and they're just going to do what they want to do and be as wicked as they want to be.
Yeah.
They think when you die, that's it.
That's right. And you know, the terminology that Solomon uses throughout this book, vanity, vexation, I mean, I don't even know that those words adequately describe the feeling we would have if we didn't know God. I mean, what's the use of living? What's the purpose? Why would I even continue? Why don't I just kill myself and end it all if there is no God? Because this life is not turning out real well. You know, I don't have as much money as I wish I had. I'm not able to enjoy the pleasures of life as much as I would like to. I've had some setbacks and some disappointments, and I'm not real happy, and I might as well just end it all. If this is all there is, and it's not much, and I'm not getting what I want. Vanity and vexation are probably mild words to describe the mindset of someone. I got to say honestly, I do not know how that people continue to live if they don't believe in God. What is the reason? What is the purpose of our existence? Why go through the disappointments of life? What did you say, Jeff?
Amen to that.
Yeah, it would be meaningless, yeah, and very frustrating. Dale?
It would be just sheer foolishness, because if you don't have God, then you're just foolish.
Yeah, it's a waste. It's a total foolish waste if there is no God. I agree. All right, so we can know what Solomon in this section is saying he couldn't figure out. Here's Solomon, who was granted enormous wisdom. And in his enormous wisdom, if he didn't have God in the perspective, even as a wise man, you can't figure it out. But we can, because God has given us that information. All right. Now, this section continues on. So you might probably just ignore that chapter break there where chapter 9 begins and just keep right on reading in the same context. Verse 1. He says, "For all this I considered in my heart, even to declare all this, that the righteous and the wise and their works are in the hand of God. No man knoweth either love or hatred by all that is before him. All things come alike to all. There's one event to the righteous and to the wicked, to the good and to the clean, and to the unclean, to him that sacrifices, to him that sacrifices not. As is the good, so is the sinner. And he that sweareth, as he that feareth an oath. This is an evil among all things that are done under the sun, that there's one event unto all. Yea, also the heart of the sons of men is full of evil, and madness is in their heart while they live, and after that they go to the dead." All right, now he did this again, Eric, there in verse 1, where he says, all are in the hand of God. Again, I think that's sort of the generic concept. Everything is somebody's got the handle on this. I don't know who he is. I don't know what he is. It's pretty clear, though, that he's not thinking of God in control like we say. God controls all things. He's not saying that. The righteous and the wise, their works are in the hand of God. So no man knoweth either love or hatred by all that is before them. Again, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true in our sense. I think we understand we know the proper biblical definition of love. We've been taught not to hate. We understand those concepts. He says you can't know that. And then he says that one thing happens to everybody. And then he lists a sort of a long list: the righteous, the wicked, the good, the clean, the unclean, those who sacrifice, those who don't sacrifice, the good, the sinner, those who swear versus those who fear to take an oath. One thing, he says, happens to them all. He says this is an evil among all things that are under the sun, that there's one event unto all. What's the one event? Death, right? So you're trying real hard to be a good person, and you won't swear or take an oath. You make your sacrifices or your service to God. You're a good person. And then here's this other guy over here, and he is just awful. He is the most corrupt, evil, immoral person that you could possibly imagine. And the same thing's going to happen to him that's going to happen to you. Well, what's the advantage? The one thing has to be death, right? Because the one thing couldn't be what we understand is going to happen to the righteous versus the wicked, right? God has told us that there is a great difference between the righteous and the wicked and the ultimate outcomes for their lives. God has told us there's a big difference. Some says there's no difference. So it has to be contextually understood that this is the way he's presenting it in this section. I think that there's great intention in this sort of presentation. We believe Solomon was inspired in writing this. So Solomon was inspired to show how a person would think and feel if he did not believe in and serve God. And it's a very dark, gloomy picture, isn't it? It's sad. It's very discouraging and depressing to think about life without God. And he's definitely in that mind frame here, right? Thoughts or comments? Anybody?
Remember 1 Peter 3:12 on that. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and their ears are open to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil.
Yeah. That would be directly contradictory to this if we didn't understand the book of Ecclesiastes as we're trying to understand it here. Exactly right. All right, so one thing happens to everybody. Well, that's true in this world perspective. In this world, One thing happens to everybody. The good and the bad and everybody else die. That's what happens. But that doesn't take into account what happens beyond the grave. Notice Solomon sort of gives a general description of sons of men in verse 3. He says, the heart of the sons of men is full of evil, and madness is in their heart while they live, and after that they go to the dead. So, that was true in Solomon's day. I would argue that's pretty true of the world of our day, right? The hearts of the son of men is full of evil. Yeah, and they live in madness. And then, but then the problem with what he says is, and then they just die. And so their hearts are full of evil. They live, they pursue madness while they are alive on earth, and then they die. That's not the end of the story. That's the end of the story as far as Solomon's concerned right here. But we know that's not the end of the story. It's certainly true that evil is in the hearts of men. In our day, we see so much evidence, and they pursue wickedness with abandon, and they're going to die. But that won't be the end of the story. That's the end of the story right here as far as Solomon's concerned, and that's not true. Thoughts or comments here? Dale?
Great to hear often that person had love in their heart, or there had goodness in their heart, and all that. But here he calls it madness in their heart. That's kind of a big blow, you might say. It's totally different.
Yeah.
To have that madness. In other words, they had no goodness in their heart.
Yeah.
But it seems like to say.
Yeah, I think you're right. All right, let's read a few more verses here. I'm in chapter 9 now, at verse 6. For to him that is joined to all the living there is hope, for a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything, neither have they any more a reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love and their hatred and their envy is now perished, neither have they any more a portion forever in anything that is done under the sun. More gloom and doom here, right? More gloom and doom on the part of Solomon. While you're still living, you have some hope. In other words, I'm still living, and tomorrow I hope to do this or that. Tomorrow I hope to engage in commerce and make some money tomorrow. Tomorrow I have hope of enjoying, a great meal. Tomorrow I have hope of whatever. The living, while they are still alive, they have some hope. But he says, basically saying that's the end of hope. All the hope you have is for what happens while you're living. And I thought it was a pretty interesting statement. A living dog is better than a dead lion. Of course, the lion, king of beasts, right? But if he's dead, he's dead. Here's a lowly mongrel dog. The dog is better than the lion because the dog is still alive and the lion is dead. Right? So, applying that to human beings, here is a glorious king with fabulous, exorbitant wealth. And here's a poor pauper, a farmer. But the king is dead now. He's died. This poor dirt farmer is still alive. Who's in better situation? Well, from a purely this world's perspective, the poor farmer is better than the dead king because he's still living and he still has some hope of, tomorrow. After you die, you got no hope at all. Solomon says, what do the living know? The living know that they will die. But the dead know not anything. Neither have they any more a reward, for their memory of them is forgotten. That's not true. That's not true in the spiritual sense, right? Because the dead do know something. We believe that the Scriptures plainly teach a conscious existence beyond the grave, right? We so often reference Luke chapter 16, the story of the rich man and Lazarus. You know that story very well. Two men died, a rich man and a poor man. A poor beggar, Lazarus, died. They both died. They went to Hades. They went to the Hadean realm. They went to the realm of departed spirits to await the final resurrection. But even in Hades, there's a place called paradise. Jesus told the thief on the cross, this day thou shalt be with me in paradise. In Luke 16, it's called Abraham's bosom, a place of comfort. And there's a place of torment. The rich man went to torment. So, but what we're drawing from that story in Luke chapter 16 is they knew what was going on. The rich man knew he was in torment. And he communicated with Abraham, send Lazarus over here to dip his finger in water and cool my tongue. I'm tormented in this flame. The rich man, and Abraham for that matter, clearly had consciousness beyond the grave. But Solomon right here says, the dead know not anything. Neither have they any more a reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Is that the only reward there is? Is how you are remembered on earth after you die? Well, according to Solomon here it is. Their love, their hatred, their envy is now perished. Neither have they any more portion forever in anything that is done under the sun. You know, that's true. I've mentioned this in our study already, but I'm always just so intrigued to think about how we forget people after they're dead. We do. It's a normal reality of our existence on earth. And I think that the great way to illustrate that is to talk about your own ancestors. And this is really a challenging thought to me. So think back one generation, your mom and dad. Obviously, you know your mom and dad. Think back another generation to your grandparents. And so you have or had four grandparents. And most of us, not everybody, but most knew their grandparents. I didn't even know all my my one grandmother died either before I was born or when I was an infant child. I never knew her. I don't know anything about her. Think back one more generation, great-grandparents. You got 8 great-grandparents. You know them? Of course, you probably never knew them. Did you know them? Could you even name your great-grandparents? That'd be 8 names. Can you come up with all 8 names? Now, most of us cannot. I can't even. I don't even know if I can name one, let alone 8. Now, if you've done some of those genealogical studies on Ancestry.com or something, So I've had people say, I know. Well, okay, if you applied yourself to research it, you might, but you really didn't know them. You might know their names now, but you didn't really know them. And then go back. So that's just 3 generations ago, right? You are the 4th generation, but if you go back 3 generations, you don't even remember your own ancestors. Now, move that forward. So I've got children who know me. I've got grandchildren who know me. But there is a great probability that my grandchildren's children won't know me. And even worse, they won't even know my name probably. Because I don't know my great-grandparents' names. My great-grandchildren probably won't know mine. Some of my great-great-grandchildren won't know. What's going to happen to you on earth? Well, Solomon says they have no more reward. The memory of them is forgotten. Their love, their hatred, their envy is now perished. Neither have they any more a portion forever in anything that is done upon the sun, under the sun. That's what happens. That's what happens in our physical existence on earth. And that's all that Solomon has in mind right here. That's what happens. Right? Thoughts or comments along those lines? Jeff?
Even great people are only footnotes in books.
Yeah.
I mean, if you happen to read a book, you might know who was king of England, in the 1400s, I'm sure he was a great man then, but
yeah. Or bring it closer to home. How about U.S. presidents? What is Joe Biden is the 46th U.S. president? Can you name all 46 presidents? Now, some really good history students might be able to rattle that off, but I couldn't even come close to naming all the U.S. presidents who obviously had significant influence on affairs in the world. They're forgotten. If they're forgotten, what do you think is going to happen to you? You're going to die and be forgotten. That's what's going to happen to you. That is just reality. Now, but on the other hand, what is going to happen to you? Well, we know that when we die, you're not like a dead dog when you die. You have an eternal soul. So what's going to happen to you is you're going to go to some sort of eternal reward. Either the reward of the righteous or the reward of the wicked. That's what's going to happen. We know that. Solomon doesn't discuss that at all here. He just says it's over. You're like a dead dog. It's over. Okay? Dale?
Larry Raspberry moved to Arkansas. They live pretty close to where my dad's parents were buried. So I told them when I was talking to them, they said, well, we went to visit where you said your grandparents were. So she researched my family, like you said, on that, and sent me all these papers where it goes way back. But I still can't tell you my great-grandparents.
Yeah.
I can tell you my grandparents.
Yeah.
Say it just, even though you may study that, it's still hard to comprehend.
Have you ever gone, I think you're right. Have you ever gone out to an old cemetery and just kind of looked around? I mean, a real old cemetery. You know, back in the day, they didn't have granite headstones that will endure for probably several centuries. A lot of times in those old graveyards, the grave markers were limestone. And in 100 or 150 years, a lot of those places, those old gravestones have just washed away. You can still see the stone, but you can't see the name. You don't know anybody about the person who's buried. At one time a friend took me to you wouldn't even have known it was there. It was an old graveyard way back off the road in the middle of a grown-up thicket. But there were a number of headstones there. They were all of that nature. Many of them broken and fallen over. All of them so washed and eroded that you couldn't make out any names. But you could see, this grave must have laid like this. There's the headstone. The body must have laid like this. But right over where the body must have been laid, big trees growing right over the grave, which made you know that this grave has been here a long time and undisturbed and unmaintained. Who was that person? That person had a life. That person had hopes and dreams and aspirations. All forgotten. Nobody knows his name. He's gone. Yeah.
Only God never forgets us or our names and what we've done.
Yeah, God won't forget us, but men will. Exactly right. Exactly right. All right, so you see the frustration that Solomon is writing here. And again, this is that mindset, and it's going to really run here through the end of chapter 9, because in this last section, he'll break over at remembering, of course, the chapter and verse designations are ours. So whoever divided it probably pretty good here in chapter 10 at verse 1. We'll start the second half of the sermon where he'll start mentioning God. Right here, all of this is life without God. But again, now, this goes to what I was saying earlier. I think it's so critically important to keep in mind these contextual breaks on the part of Solomon, because if you didn't do that, if you just snatched this passage out of the broader context of the book, it's contradictory with other parts of Scripture if you view it, unless you view it properly and contextually. What this passage is saying is not true to the rest of the Bible. Now, the reason why that becomes an issue is because some religious groups are bad to try and snatch things out of the book of Ecclesiastes to teach their false doctrine. The Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance, the Jehovah's Witnesses teach that there's no conscious existence beyond the grave. And they actually teach that the wicked are annihilated. They believe that the righteous, God will sort of recreate the righteous dead. They're dead and there is no memory of them. They are unconscious. They have no conscience. Even the righteous dead have no conscious existence beyond the grave. God will sort of bring them back and recreate them in the end. But right now they're dead like a dog. And the wicked are dead and annihilated forever. They'll never come back. And they like to use this verse. They like to use this passage that we're reading right here. The dead know not anything. The living know they're going to die, but the dead know not anything. See that? The Jehovah's Witness fellow that you're studying with says, see, that is exactly what I'm telling you. How are you going to counter that? How are you going to counter that false teaching? Because that's what this verse says, right? Well, the only way to answer that is to answer it with the broader understanding of the whole book of Ecclesiastes. Now, I'll tell you right up front, because I've experienced this on more than one occasion. It's hard to get that point across to the Jehovah's Witness guy who comes knocking at your door and wants to study the Bible with you. That's really a hard point to get across to them, but it just is the critical understanding of the book. Alex?
That topic is one of the divides between the Jewish sects. You had the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and one believed in the resurrection and the other didn't.
Yeah.
But so this passage is probably a difficult study for them as well.
Yeah.
But we know from the teachings of Jesus the conclusion of that debate.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So, again, sometimes we talk about studying things in context, which is so important. Certainly, it's important to study the book of Ecclesiastes in context, but you have to study the book of Ecclesiastes in the broader context of the whole Bible. Because you got whatever conclusions we reach here has to harmonize with the rest of the Bible, and I think this is the only way to do it. Okay, let's read just a little bit further here. Verse 7. I'm in chapter 9, verse 7. Go thy way, eat thy bread with joy, drink thy wine with a merry heart, for God now accepteth thy works. Let thy garments be always white, let thy head lack no ointment. Live joyfully with the wife whom thou lovest all the days of thy life, of thy vanity, which he hath given thee under the sun, all the days of thy vanity, for that is thy portion in this life, and in thy labor which thou takest under the sun. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. For there's no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave whither thou goest. All right, now does this again. He mentions God in this, verse 7. God now accepteth thy works. He mentions him again there in... anyway... But the last verse here, verse 10, is the key one. There's no work, nor advice, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave whither thou goest. So he's still in that view of you're going to die and it's all over, right? He's still in that mindset. So again, with that being true, if it is true, it's not true, but if it was true, what do? Go your way. Do your thing. We would say, do your own thing. Do your own thing. Eat your bread with joy. Drink wine with a merry heart. The phrase that's a little confusing there, God now accepteth thy works. Again, I think that's in this sense of the powers that be, whoever they are, allows you to do what you do now. Let your garments be always white. People wore white garments to a feast or a festival. So, party. He said, have a party. Let thy head lack no ointment. They anointed their head when they were dressed up, and when they were cleaned up and fixed, you would anoint your head with oil. Live joyfully with the wife, whom thou lovest all the days of thy life, thy vanity. It's here, it's now. Go for it. Under the sun, which he giveth thee under the sun, all the days of thy vanity. For that is thy portion in this life, and thy labor which thou takest under the sun. And whatever. Now this is a verse that you've heard before, verse 10. Whatsoever thy hand finds to do, do with thy might. Sometimes we use that verse out of context. We use that verse to say, man, work hard at what you're doing. This is saying work hard at what you're doing because that's all there is. There is no more. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do with thy might. For there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave whither thou goest. This, again, we know that there is something beyond the grave. We know there is knowledge beyond the grave. Again, that story of the rich man and Lazarus so clearly paints that picture for us. So again, you see Solomon's frustration. I guess that's we just keep repeating that. In this whole section, you'd say, since life is uncertain and death awaits all, go for it. Get all the enjoyment that you can right now. Is pretty much the idea of these verses. That, again, that phrase, God accepts. Let's see, that's in verse 7. Let me read you another version. In verse 7, the New International Version says, go, eat your food with gladness and drink your wine with a joyful heart, for it is now that God favors what you do. The New American Standard Version says God has already approved your works. So again, that's a little confusing, but has to, I think, be understood as in the sense of God or whoever, the powers that be, allow it to be so for you right now. So do it. The powers that be haven't favored me so well. And so I'm not able to be joyful. I'm not able to eat bread, drink wine. I don't even have a wife. The powers that be have not favored me so much. But if the powers that be have favored you, Solomon says, go for it. Get all the enjoyment you can right now, because after you go to the grave, there's nothing will be left. You see that? I think that's the sense of God here. And this is not the real God. This is God in the sense of whoever's doling this out. If they've doled out good things to you, enjoy it. Eric.
Well, he's also, I know he's bringing from a worldly perspective here, but it would also make sense that he's mentioning and acknowledging God at the end when he's got this all figured out.
Yeah.
And he's going back after he's got everything solved.
Yeah, and there are places in the book where he credits the good of life to God's blessings. And there I think he's talking about really God. Whereas here I would argue that he has the idea of whoever is in control. Dale?
You agree, I think sometimes that, Solomon went in full circle, we might say. He started out from a rich man's son. He was King David's son. But, I think he knew religion as a young boy. His dad was very religious. But I think then he got worldly and he had to, try out all these things, like you might say.
Yeah.
But then as he got older, then he see the mistakes that he
And
made.
again, he learned this by his own experience, that there's no satisfaction in the worldly pursuits of life. There's just no satisfaction in that. He learned that for sure.
I think that brought him back into that same circle, and he realized then a lot of things he did was really bad and wrong.
I think you're right. I think you're exactly right. All right, we're out of time. Let's mark it there, and we'll continue. Remember where we are. We're still in this fourth sermon, in the first part of the fourth sermon, until we get to chapter 10. Thanks, everybody.